Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining today. Uh, okay, enable dictation. Okay, all right. This is the last in the series on great American writers. Today we'll deal with clearly the most controversial, I would say, of all contemporary American writers, Philip Roth. Last time we discussed Saul Bellow, I believe. Bellow, who was a contemporary of Roth and equally honored in every imaginable category. But I'm not sure how many people are reading Saul Bellow today, but I am absolutely certain that many, many people are still reading Philip Roth, especially since the publication 3 days ago of a massive biography by Blake Bailey called Philip Roth. It's 900 pages. I intend to read every single word with great scrupulous care because I've been a devotee of Philip Roth since college. Yeah, it has to be college because his first book was published in 1959 when I was a junior at Northwestern University. At the time of his death from heart failure, one thing about Philip Roth, a lot of people don't understand, is that he was severely ill. He suffered from agonizing back problems ever since his Army experience. He suffered from a very weak heart. He had severe emotional problems, had a very serious emotional breakdown at one point, was in such despair that he actually contemplated suicide. These facts are not too well known by millions of his readers, but he did die actually almost exactly 3 years ago, May 2018, of heart failure. He was 85 years old. And let me just quote some words from the New York Times obituary of Philip Roth. They called him a towering novelist who explored lust, Jewish life, and America. A prolific and protean, meaning incredibly changeable and often blackly comic novelist who is a preeminent figure in 20th century literature. Absolutely true. He was probably the most honored of all living American novelists. And yet, as we know, he escaped or was denied the highest honor of all, and that is, of course, the Nobel Prize. Why Philip Roth never received the Nobel Prize, even though everybody acknowledges he more than deserved it, I think was simply because of the notoriety of his name, which for decades was almost synonymous with eruptive communal and individual fury. His very name was a flashpoint for controversy, for outrage, for ethnic and communal horror and anger. It goes back decades. It's no longer true, I would strongly suggest, but it was for many, many decades. And I would say the alleged charge of misogyny still persists with a number of women readers. The allegation that Philip Roth really didn't like women and treated them fairly consistently unfairly in his works. Now, that's a highly debatable point. He vehemently denies that he was misogynistic, but it's a question of literary debate. But not even Roth's most vehement detractors could possibly deny his sheer literary brilliance, nor the simple fact that he was probably the most sustained and long-lived writer of high-quality fiction. And his career, to me and to millions of others, is simply extraordinary. No other writer that I can think of, maybe Bellow, who wrote deep into his 80s, but very few writers can boast of such a lengthy career, beginning with Goodbye Columbus in 1959, when he was 26 years old, to his last novel, Nemesis. And if you haven't read it, I urge you to read it. It's a wonderful short novel, which was published in 2010 when Philip Roth was approaching 80 years of age. Goodbye Columbus, which is a novella, also included three of Roth's most famous short stories, Conversion of the Jews, Defender of the Faith, and Eli the Fanatic. All this accomplished when he was simply 25 years old. Clearly the most honored writer of his generation, National Book Award, National Book Critics Award. He won the Penn-Faulkner Award 3 different times. He won the Pulitzer Prize for American Pastoral. The Human Stain, which came out in 2000, was awarded the United Kingdom's W.H. Smith Award for the Best Novel of the Year. I hope many of you have picked up these novels. In 2001, in Prague, Czechoslovakia, Philip Roth received the newly inaugurated Franz Kafka Prize. Another interesting fact about Philip Roth, he had many flaws, clearly. Could often be cruel, even to some of his closest friends. But in terms of generosity to other writers, he was unparalleled. And he was particularly interested in Eastern European writers. And it was Philip Roth who really brought forth to a popular acclaim Eastern Europe writers like Milan Kundera and Ivan Klima. And he was personally responsible for the publication of 17 Eastern European writers translated into English. 2010, many of us remember President Barack Obama awarding Philip Roth the National Humanities Medal in the East Room of the White House. The picture was distributed all over the world. He published over a period of 51 years an amazing output. It's simply beyond belief. 31 novels, an autobiography, dozens of essays, the most famous of which I want to talk about today, which is an essay called Writing About Jews, which is not only a very spirited defense against his most vehement critics, but one of the most powerful explanations of what literature is really all about. His novels range freely. I think the word protean is well chosen. Early work like Our Gang, a political satire on the Nixon administration, to a kind of dystopian, nightmarish alternative history. The Plot Against America proved to be very, very popular, not only when it was printed, but also the most recent HBO 4-part dramatization on television. I hope many of you saw it. It's marvelous. And finally, 2 very sweeping social statements and analyses of America that we see in American Pastoral. An amazing achievement. Interesting, May 21st, 2006, the New York Times Book Review announced the results of a letter that the New York Times sent to a couple of hundred literary critics, literary sages, spokespeople of high intellectual caliber, other writers, and they asked a simple question. Identify, please, the single best work of American fiction published in the last 25 years. 6 of Roth's novels were selected. American Pastoral, The Counterlife, Operation Shylock, Sabbath's Theater, The Human Stain, and The Plot Against America. In an accompanying letter, one critic, A.O. Scott, said, if we had all been given the choice of the single best writer of fiction of the past 25 years, we would clearly have chosen Philip Roth. In a later study in 2013, 30 literary figures said that Philip Roth is simply the greatest living American writer. I found very interesting a comment by Rick Gagowski, an eminent British critic, who paid tribute to Roth's lifetime achievement. He writes the following: in 1959, Philip Roth writes Goodbye Columbus, and it's a masterpiece. It's magnificent. 51 years later, he's 78 years old, and he writes Nemesis. And it is so wonderful. Such a terrific novel, and it is. I urge you to read it. Tell me one other writer who, 50 years apart, writes masterpieces. If you look at the trajectory of the average writer, no matter how good, you'll find an early period of kind of apprenticeship, learning, then evolving into a mid-phase, which creates the most significant achievements of a good writer's career. And then what you see in middle age is the beginning to the waning of the quality writing, and ultimately a fading away of a once brilliant talent that simply never applied to Philip Roth. He gets better and better, Gagowski said, in middle age. In the 1990s, he was almost incapable of not writing a masterpiece. The Human Stain, The Plot Against America, I Married a Communist. He was 68, 70 years old. What the hell is a guy doing writing such wonderful work at that age? 9 of Roth's novels and short stories were adopted to the screen. Goodbye Columbus was a great success. It came out in 1969. It starred my college friend, Richard Benjamin, and it was a commercial success. On a tiny budget of $1.5 million, it grossed over $25 million. Portnoy's Complaint came out in 1972, a total cinematic disaster. One of the worst examples of a botched attempt to translate a best-selling novel onto the screen. The film is very hard to get a hold of nowadays because it was so awful. The studio really tried to bury it. And it again starred my unfortunate college friend, Richard Benjamin. Really hurt his career, to say the least. The Human Stain came out in 2005. I don't know if you saw it. It starred Anthony Hopkins and Nicole Kidman. The Dying Animal came out in 2008. It was called Elegy. It starred Ben Kingsley and Penelope Cruz. Nobody saw it. It was very commercially, I think, unsuccessful. Al Pacino starred in a late short novel called The Humbling, 2014. Not good. Indignation, a very, very haunting, powerful short novel, came out in 2016, and the critics loved it. Starred Logan Lerman and Tracy Letts. And in 2016, the same year, American Pastoral, conceivably in the minds of many people, Philip Roth's finest work, was made into a film by the actor Ewan McGregor, who wrote it, who starred in it, who produced it, and it commercially failed. I saw the film and I thought it was excellent. I'm in total disagreement with the critics of the public. The Ghostwriter was adopted for television back in 1984. And again, just a year ago, HBO presented a 4-part television dramatization of The Plot Against America, which I thought was wonderful. Now, here's what's interesting. Notice that Saul Bellow, brilliant writer, honored almost as much as Philip Roth. The only film that was made from any of Saul Bellow's works was Seize the Day, which is a film made for television. I think we discussed this before. It starred, of all people, Robin Williams, who gave a wonderful performance as Tommy Wilhelm. I can't think of another screen dramatization of a Saul Bellow work. Now, I find this interesting Bellow was a brilliant writer, but did not lend himself really to that kind of public accessibility that we clearly see in Philip Roth. Some bio. Roth was born, as many people know, in Newark, New Jersey on March 19th, 1933, 5 years before my birth, so I'm a contemporary of Philip Roth's. Anybody from Newark? Newark in the 1930s and 40s was a large Jewish community of 60,000 Jews. Now, of course, it's predominantly African American, but at one point it was one of the largest small city Jewish communities in the country. He grew up at 81 Summit Avenue in the Wequahic neighborhood. Today, his house is now a national monument. It has been marked off for historic significance. And all of the associations that Roth infiltrated from Newark into his writings have been, in effect, canonized. His parents were second-generation Americans. One set coming from Lvov, which is, I think, today in Ukraine. For years it was Russia, then it was part of Poland. And the other parentage element of the family came from Kiev in Ukraine. Roth graduated from Wequahic High School in 1950, and he features his high school predominantly in Goodbye Columbus and Portnoy's Complaint. Goodbye Columbus also mentions a number of locations in Newark which have become famous: the Empire Burlesque, the Wequahic Diner, the Newark Museum, the Newark Public Library, all local landmarks that featured prominently in Roth's early life and fed his very rich literary imagination. In his yearbook, the high school yearbook, he's described as very clever, intellectual, as well as funny, very, very funny. He was known in high school, and he was known throughout his entire life as an incredible mimic. He could mimic any voice, any situation, and he literally dazzled his friends and admirers with this talent. He attended Rutgers University for a year, as did the protagonist Neil Klugman in Goodbye Columbus. And then he transferred to Bucknell College in Pennsylvania. Why? I'm not sure. Maybe it's because it was a very non-Jewish school. He majored in English, graduated magna cum laude, and was a member of the Phi Beta Kappa. He received a scholarship to the University of Chicago, earned an MA there in English literature, and this Chicago background provides the setting for his second novel, Letting Go. I don't think many people read it today. I read it when I was teaching, I remember, at a state university in Washington. I loved it at that time. I'm not sure I could read it now. In 1955, he enlisted in the Army, but received a very serious back injury during basic training, a back injury which never left him. He suffered torments from back pain throughout his entire life. He got a medical discharge, and that Army experience provided the background for perhaps his most controversial, but I would say perhaps also his most wonderful, memorable short story, The Defender of the Faith. If you haven't read it, I urge you to read it. Roth spent years in academia, teaching creative writing at the University of Iowa, at Princeton, the University of Pennsylvania, before retiring from academic life in 1991. From 1991 on, he just devoted himself entirely to writing. At the end of my remarks, at the end of our discussion, we'll play a 5-minute interview with Philip Roth, which I found very, very revealing and quite accessible into his personality and character. Goodbye, Columbus and 5 short stories won the National Book Award in 1959. And overnight, Philip Roth became a literary sensation, a young man of acknowledged talent and bright future. He published Letting Go in 1962, and then a novel called When She Was Good in 1967. Again, I don't know if anybody reads When She Was Good today, but it's a remarkable achievement, and I think a repudiation of the charge of misogyny. Philip Roth had difficulty with his 2 ex-wives, tremendous difficulty, and made him very, very bitter. But When She Was Good brings the reader through a male perspective, male novelist, brings the reader into the inner psyche of a young, non-Jewish, deeply troubled, emotionally distraught woman. And it's a remarkable achievement for a man, no matter how brilliant a writer, to penetrate into the inner psyche of a young woman. I think that's quite remarkable. His first marriage was really catastrophic. He married a woman called Maggie Martinson, who was a waitress in a local diner in Chicago. I'd have to read the biography to really understand his motivation for marrying this woman. They were only married for 2 years. He was tricked into the marriage. She claimed she was pregnant. He never wanted children. She said, I will get an abortion on one condition, and that is if you marry me. She wasn't pregnant. She faked it. He was tricked into the marriage, went through painful years of agonizing court proceedings, alimony battles, and bitterness until Maggie Martinson was killed in a car crash. But 1969 is the watershed year for Philip Roth. That is the year he wrote Portnoy's Complaint, that catapulted him into notoriety, into bestsellerdom, and into wealth. Portnoy's Complaint became a literary sensation, sold 500,000 copies in its first year, and became the talk of the country, as we all remember. It's still a subject of tremendous talk and debate. It's still read, I'm sure, by hundreds of thousands of people around the world. And the novel, as you know, comically stereotypes the Jewish mother as an eternally smothering, intrusive, obsessional, emasculating, and dominating presence in the life of a young Jewish man. The novel was a rebellion, not only against the maternal, suffocating influence of the mother, but also against what Roth experienced and perceived as the suffocating atmosphere of middle-class, fresh immigrant Jewish life in America, with manifold examples of constraint of every imaginable type on one's normal, natural instincts, the most common, of course, being that of the sexual instinct. But even before the publication of Portnoy's Complaint, Roth came under furious criticism from some of the short stories that he wrote, as well as Goodbye, Columbus, Conversion of the Jews, Defender of the Faith, Epstein. Epstein in particular caused a great deal of distress in the Jewish community, but more so Defender of the Faith. Now, Defender of the Faith, I don't know if you've read it, is the story of a Jewish recruit, young Jewish recruit at an army base in Missouri at the very end of World War II, who deviously and cleverly and connivingly manipulates the emotions of his staff sergeant, a fellow Jew named Nathan Marks, who had come back from 2 years of combat in World War II. He tries to manipulate Marx into giving him special favors simply on the basis of the fact that they're both Jewish. Now, this was a pretty scandalous subject to be brooded about outside of the Jewish community. In the pages of The New Yorker, which was a national magazine read by hundreds of thousands of non-Jews. Roth's sin was simple. I spent my life reading Jewish literature, and I spent 32 years as a professional in the organized Jewish community. Those of you who are not Jewish may find this a bit startling, but Roth's sin was simple. He had the audacity to write about a Jewish kid as being deeply flawed, as being aggressive and conniving and materialistic, and he had the gall to publish this in a national magazine read by hundreds of thousands of non-Jews. The basic tenet in the Jewish community, particularly at that time, remember, this was not long after World War II, you don't air your dirty laundry in front of the non-Jew. That's all there is to it. And if you defied that communal imperative, you faced massive vituperation. Letters poured in. Mr. Roth, with your one-story defender of the faith, you have done as much harm as all the organized anti-Semitic organizations have done to make people believe that Jews are cheats, liars, connivers. Your one story makes people, the general public, forget all the Jews who have loved, all the Jews who have lived, all the Jewish boys who served well in the armed services, all the Jews who live honest, hard lives the world over. One letter came to the Anti-Defamation League. What is being done to silence this man? Medieval Jews would have known what to do with him. Another letter. Can you honestly say, Mr. Roth, that there is anything in your story that would not warm the heart of a Julius Streicher or a Joseph Goebbels? Roth tried to answer as logically as he could. We're not living in Nazi Germany. We're living in the United States of America, which is the opposite of Nazi Germany. We live in America where Jews are not only increasingly accepted, admired, but even emulated. But he got nowhere. There was a famous incident at Yeshiva University in Washington Heights. He appeared on a panel. Interesting, the panel was entitled Minority Writers in America. And on the panel was Ralph Ellison, the author of Invisible Man. I'm not sure who else was on the panel. All the fury was directed at Roth, and he barely got out of the room without being literally physically assaulted. Now, he was upset by all this. As tough as he is, he was really distraught by all this vituperative criticism. In 1969, he published his Portnoy's complaint, as if to tell all the critics out there, you want outrage? I'll show you outrage. And we have Portnoy's complaint. If Goodbye Columbus was upsetting, Portnoy's complaint was devastating. Now, Portnoy's complaint, the decision to write the novel, set entirely in the office of a psychoanalyst, allowed Roth to absolutely exude his rage, his obscenity, his stand-up comedy routines, and a context for pure, unfiltered confession. In Roth's own words, I needed permission, and permission came with casting the book as a psychoanalytic confession. The theater of the analyst's office says the rule here is that there are no rules. The rule here is no inhibitions. Here is no restraint. The rule here is no decorum. Alexander Portnoy is conflicted. He yearns to be a good Jewish boy, to lash himself to the mast of respectability, and at the same time rages against all the ropes that would bind him there: family, religion, social taboos. Here's one passage that'll give you an indication of the rage that filters through the novel. The Yiddish terms may not be familiar to non-Jews. I'll try to explain it. Look, says Alexander to his shrimp, am I exaggerating to think it's practically miraculous and I'm ambulatory? The hysteria and the superstition coming from the Jewish community, the watch its and the be carefuls. You mustn't do this, you can't do that, hold it, don't, you're breaking an important law. What law? Whose law? They might as well have plates in their lips and rings through their noses and painted themselves blue for all the human sense they made. Oh, and the milchiks and the fleischiks, besides all those meshugana rules and regulations on top of their own private craziness. It's a family joke that when I was a tiny child, I turned from the window out of which I was watching a rainstorm and hopefully asked Mama, do we believe in winter? Do you get what I'm saying? I was raised by Hottentots and Zulus. I couldn't even contemplate drinking a glass of milk with my salami sandwich without giving serious offense to God Almighty. Imagine then what my conscience gave me for all that jerking off. Well, nobody had ever read anything like this in a best-selling public novel, but it sold furiously and made him famous and rich. Now, Roth's response to all this was manifest in one of the most famous essays, I think, of modern, certainly American literature. I've read this essay, I've taught it, and I've read it repeatedly. It's simply brilliant. And I urge you to go online and just print it out, Writing About Jews. It was published in Commentary magazine, a Jewish intellectual journal. And let me share the basic ideas that flow out of this incredible essay. First of all, Roth insists that all of his critics misinterpret his intent. I do not disapprove of my fellow Jews, but rather find them profoundly interesting as studies in human behavior. My readers mistake my respect for energy, courage, and spontaneity for disapproval. For example, some readers criticize my story Epstein because the central character is a Jewish man who commits adultery. Why, they say, do you focus on a Jewish man who commits adultery? I focus on Epstein because I'm interested in the adulterer Epstein, the complicated individual who is caught between conflicting internal images of himself, the man he is and the man he originally perceived himself to be. A poor reader may dismiss Epstein simply as adulterer, but the Epstein in my story experiences himself as something more. And it is this something more that lies at the heart of literature. Fiction is not written to affirm the principles and beliefs that everybody seems to hold, nor does it seek to guarantee us of the appropriateness of our feelings. The world of fiction, in fact, frees us from the circumscriptions, from the constraints that society places upon feeling. One of the greatnesses of the art is that it allows both the writer and the reader to respond to experience in ways not always available in day-to-day conduct. Or if they are available, they are not possible, or manageable, or legal, or advisable, or even necessary to the business of living. Literature, in effect, transcends a court of law. It takes us into a safe world where often hidden feelings and emotions can be given free rein. And this expansion through literature of moral consciousness and moral fantasy is valuable to man and society. Wow. Well, why? Why does he feel it is valuable to take the reader into forbidden areas of hidden feelings and emotions that we cannot manifest in our normal lives? I have a feeling that it goes back to Freud and the fact that we are constantly dealing with our daily attempt to suppress the id, which is where all our inchoate and primitive feelings derive. And we try to keep those primitive feelings under constraint by the ego, which is ultimately supervised by the superego. And this conflict between our inner emotional drives that are simply not acceptable in normal life and the ego trying to suppress them is what causes neurosis. So we're all neurotic, almost by definition, if we're civilized. I am interested in exploring the inner depths of human character. That's my job as a novelist. I am a creative writer of fiction. I am interested not in adultery as a sin, but in the actual condition of the adulterer. I love Epstein, said Roth, and I feel deeply sorry for him. Not because he commits adultery, but why he commits adultery. The rabbis would like me to write about the noble saga of the Jewish people. But my interest as a writer is not the saga of Jewish history, but the story of a particular Jew named Epstein, who I consider to be of crucial importance. The story of Lou Epstein stands or falls not on how much I know about Jewish tradition and history, but on how much I know and understand about Lou Epstein. As humanly flawed as he is, Epstein is too valuable to forget or dismiss. The concerns of fiction, let it be said, are not that of a statesman or a public relations firm. The novelist asks himself, what do people think? The PR man asks, what will people think? Now, my friends, pay attention. This is really important. If great writers really cared about what their public might think, or if a great writer really catered to public morality, Nabakov would never have written Lolita, which was named the fourth greatest novel in English of the 20th century. Dostoevsky would never have written Crime and Punishment. Mark Twain would never have written The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Flaubert would never have written Madame Bovary. Thomas Mann would never have written Death in Venice. Ralph Ellison would not have written Invisible Man. Richard Wright would not have written Native Son. And most certainly Alice Walker would not have written The Color Purple. All of these novels proved incendiary and controversial and deeply disturbing to the morally complacent public which read them. Roth points out, for instance, the huge controversy over Defender of the Faith totally ignores the fact that the other protagonist of the story is Sergeant Nathan Marks, who is a profoundly decent man, a decent Jewish man, manipulated by Grossbart, who is the unpleasant, unsavory young co-protagonist of the story. Marx is completely ignored by poor readers, blotted out by Jewish paranoia regarding Grossbart. But even Grossbart is complicated because Philip Roth is a brilliant writer. He doesn't simply create totally negative characters. Grossbart is a young man, in his mind, simply trying to survive in a very difficult situation. And if it requires conniving and manipulation and deception and lies, so be it. That's what he's going to have to do. The rabbis are suggesting, Roth said, that some subjects and characters should not be presented because they may be misinterpreted by bigots. But this apprehension allows bigots to determine the subject matter of literature. This is not fighting anti-Semitism. This is submitting to it. If you restrict consciousness, you restrict literary communication simply because of bigots. Now, if prejudice exists in America, we must fight it at every step of the way. But not by putting on our best face or by making Jews invisible or by ignoring the complexities of Jewish life and character. And in probably the most famous statement in writing about Jews, Roth makes the following emphatic point. The solution to anti-Semitism is not to convince people to like Jews so as not to want to kill them. It is to let them know that they cannot kill Jews even if they despise them. How best to fight anti-Semitism if you're a writer? By making Jews real and complicated and deep and conflicted like all other human beings. To bring Jewish characters to life is to repudiate stereotypes and distorted mythical images. So in the end, after all the Sturm und Drang, the question today is, was Philip Roth bad for the Jews or good for the Jews? Obviously, I'm a great admirer of Philip Roth from my college days. I've read 29 of his 31 novels. I've taught Defender of the Faith, Goodbye Columbus, Eli the Fanatic, Conversion of the Jews on many occasions. And what we see, and it's interesting, we see the evolution of Philip Roth as the notorious, scandalous, incendiary writer of the 50s and 60s into one of the most honored literary figures of our time. And this evolution also reflects the evolution of the Jew in America. I grew up in the 1950s when people were still very sensitive about being Jewish. You couldn't live in certain communities. You were forbidden from entering fraternities in college and country clubs. We all grew up in that time, senior citizens. That's changed. Not that anti-Semitism is gone, but certainly the role of the Jew in American society has certainly changed. Roth received an honorary degree from the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is the bastion of conservative Judaism in America. And in his acceptance speech, he said, "Oh, my father would have loved to have seen me here on the dais. I welcome this honor. Who takes Jews more seriously than the Jewish Theological Seminary? And what writer takes Jews more seriously than I do?" Dr. Arnold Eisen, who was head of the Jewish Theological Seminary, was called by a journalist when the honorary degree was announced. And Eisen said, "At the Jewish Theological Seminary, we are not looking for piety in literature. No one has written more acutely about Israel," referring to the incredible novel, The Counterlife. Nobody has written more eloquently about the relationship between Israel and the diaspora. And for that matter, nobody has written more articulately about circumcision than Philip Roth. He questions Jewish life and identity and their dilemmas. And these questions have always been the right questions, even if I don't always agree with his answers. The outrage that greeted him early in his career belongs to another era. So does his sense of being a pariah. The writer Shaul Magid, in a heartfelt and insightful article on Roth shortly after Roth's death, commented that Roth, despite his insistence on being called an American writer rather than a Jewish writer, Roth was very, very sensitive about this, as was Saul Bellow, pointed out that Roth's use, manipulation, parody, obsession, subversion, and yes, even diabolical love of Jewishness and Judaism made him one of the great Jewish writers of the past century. In today's America, there is nothing to hide about being Jewish. He believed in America, and he believed that Jews were deeply a part of America. So Roth gave us a way to see ourselves as a people at home in America. Roth spoke from the Jewish psyche. He was never afraid of it. He was never intimidated by it. He was never ashamed of it. If you were asked what he thought about being a Jew, he would have replied, I can't think of being anything else. That kind of Jewishness, equal parts nostalgia and rebellion, neurosis and genius, comedy and tragedy, is one of our generation's great contributions to the chain of Jewish tradition. Roth was an important voice in that movement. Magid says, may we be comforted on the loss of one of our foremost creative geniuses. Chris, let me play, if I can get this. This is an interview with Philip Roth by the BBC.
Larry, do you want me to share my screen and try it that way?
Yeah, I think it would be better, sure.
Okay.
And we have the video, right?
Yes. Just take a minute.
I know very little when I begin. I know that first impulse and the first sentence. Very often the first sentence that I begin with is not the first sentence that I end with, but in the case of The Humbling, it is. This book, I had one line, which was the opening line of the book. He'd lost his magic. And that was because I'd heard a story about an actor, a very distinguished actor, who at one point in his career was unable to act. And that stayed with me. And I thought this line, he'd lost his magic. And that was what I began with. I just pursued it then line by line. All at once, Axler was alone in the house, in the country, and terrified of killing himself. Now there was nothing stopping him. Now he could go ahead and do what he found himself unable to do while she was still there. Walk up the stairs to the attic, load the gun, put the barrel in his mouth, and reach down with his long arms to pull the trigger. The gun as the sequel to The Wife.
Philip Roth is one of the most garlanded authors of his generation, and over the last 50 years he's immersed himself in exploring the American condition. But he's despondent about culture in America in 2009.
I don't think reading is in a good situation at the moment. I think the readers have succumbed to the lure of other things. And reading began to suffer with the invention of the screen, that is to say, the movie screen. And then there was a television screen, and finally there was a computer screen. And I don't think that reading is able to win people away from those screens, but rather loses them in great numbers.
Do you think now that the world in which we live is a darker and darker place?
Since I've been alive, it seems the world has been a darker place. I was born into the Depression. I was a little one, didn't know about it, but my parents lived through it. The Depression ended, and then the war began, World War II. I was old enough to understand that. World War II ended and the Cold War began. Now the Cold War ended and the fight with radical Islam has begun. So it's always been a dark place in my experience.
Do you think that happiness in life is very fleeting?
Shall I speak from personal experience?
Yeah, why not?
It's a rare state. It's not the normal state, I don't think. It happens from time to time.
But it's not your natural state.
No, I think not.
Well-
Nor is unhappiness. I think one goes along in neutral.
In all, Roth has so far written over 30 books and has 2 short novels about to be published, The Humbling and Nemesis. Do you feel a greater urgency to, as it were, to kind of cut to the chase and produce sharp, shorter novels?
I don't know what the reason is. I've written with the Nemesis, which is coming out a year from now. I will have written 4 short novels in the last 4 years or so. I don't know what causes the short books or what causes the long books. Whatever comes my way, I produce.
But can you imagine starting a long narrative novel?
I would love to do that.
Would you?
Yes.
You have maybe another 25 years writing in you.
25.
Wow, yeah, I mean, you're only 75.
That's quite a sentence.
Do you not look forward to that? Is work not your joy?
Work is my joy and my burden. Yes, I would love to spend the rest of my life working on one book. That would mean I wouldn't have to think up another book.
An intensely private man, Philip Roth shies away from the fame that attends his work, and his engagement with the outside world is carefully calibrated.
I get up in the morning, have my breakfast, and go and take a swim, and then I get to work. And I work till 6 o'clock at night, and then I turn the news on and watch the news, and I eat my dinner, and I read, and I go to sleep. So I'm not in the turbulence.
Are you lonely?
No, not lonely.
So, in terms of release and joy, what do you do? I mean, do you listen to music? What do you do? I mean, I can't believe that you lead this life that seems so kind of
Austere.
austere.
And I do lead a life that seems austere, even to me. It's the only way I know to get my work done, is to get my exercise and pay attention to what's going on in the world, and to read in the evenings, and during the day to devote myself to my work.
And what about frivolity?
I devote 1 day a year to frivolity, usually.
Oh, and what happens on
I
that?
don't know what happens. I haven't done it yet this year.
Okay, what did you do last year?
I've forgotten.
Overwhelmed by the 364 other
Yes,
days.
right.
Philip Roth, thank you very much.
Thank you.
A bit disjointed voice and lip sync, but I think you get the picture. Am I still on? Everybody hear me? Hello?
I hear you.
Oh, okay. Let me take this opportunity to read a passage from the Defender of the Faith, his most controversial story. I want to read this to give you a sense of the sheer quality of Roth's prose. This is a scene regarding Sergeant Nathan Marks, who spent the last 2 years of his life in dreadful combat throughout the European theater of war. He is stimulated, although equally annoyed by this young recruit, Sheldon Grosspart, but he can't help but feel somewhat seduced by his lost sense of Jewish identity, lost in the sheer brutality of survival in combat. Let me read this passage. Even after they disappeared over the parade ground, whose green was now a deep blue, I could hear Grosspart singing the double-time cadence, and as it grew dimmer and dimmer, it suddenly touched a deep memory, as did the slant of the light. And I was remembering the shrill sounds of a Bronx playground where years ago, beside the Grand Concourse, I had played on long spring evenings such as this. It was a pleasant memory for a young man so far from peace and home, and it brought so many recollections with it that I began to grow exceedingly tender about myself. In fact, I indulged myself in a reverie so strong that I felt as though a hand were reaching down inside me. It had to reach so very far to touch me. It had to reach past those days in the forests of Belgium and past the dying I'd refused to weep over, past the nights in German farmhouses whose books we'd burned to warm us, past endless stretches when I had shut off all the softness I might feel from my fellows and had managed even to deny myself the posture of a conqueror, the swagger that I, as a Jew, might well have worn as my boots whacked against the rubble of Wesel, Münster, and Braunschweig. But now, one night noise, one rumor of home and time past, and memory plunged down through all I had anesthetized and came to what I suddenly remembered was myself. So it was not altogether curious that in search of more of me, I found myself following Grossbart's tracks to chapel number 3, where the Jewish services were being held. That is simply beautiful prose, written when he was still in his mid-20s. Chris, whatever time we have left, I'd love to hear comments, questions, thoughts, personal experiences with Philip Roth, whatever people want to share.
Somebody did have a question in the chat. If you could repeat the name of the source of the quote about fiction giving us freedom. She thinks it was in reference to Epstein.
Yeah, this comes from his essay, Writing About Jews. All you have to do is Google it with the title in by Roth and it'll pop up. It's fairly long, but to me, it's an absolute must read. It's simply a brilliant piece, which I never tire of reading and rereading, Writing About Jews. Yeah.
Thanks. That was kind of a breakthrough thought for me, and I want to read it again and focus on it a little more and share it with my book group.
Good, excellent.
Thanks.
Sure. Any other thoughts, comments?
Okay. Chris, I guess I'm amazed at the courage it takes to be a writer. You know, you're revealing something about yourself, or maybe you're not, maybe it's your fantasies. And I love that idea that being a writer can take you beyond the law. So you can write about.
It transcends a court of law.
Yeah.
When you read fiction that takes you into very strange places, you literally suspend your normal moral daily judgment. How else can you possibly read Nabokov's Lolita? Why is Lolita an absolutely scandalous novel about pederasty? One of the most, vehement of all sins, the one that we all condemn. And yet Nabakov takes that daring step and writes about what is absolutely unthinkable in normal life and produces the 4th greatest novel in English of the 20th century. And this is remarkable. Crime and Punishment. You're brought into the psyche of Raskolnikov, an axe murderer. It's not that you suspend your judgment of Raskolnikov's murder, but you're taken into his psyche. You see him as a tortured human being. Now, whether you want to do this or not is your choice as a reader. But millions of people over the past 100 some odd years have read Crime and Punishment. Black people were appalled at Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man or Richard Wright's Native Son, particularly Alice Walker's The Color Purple. This caused tremendous distress in the Black community because Alice Walker confronted male brutality within the Black community, the subjection of women to male dominance and cruelty. Every ethnic community is extremely nervous if they're in a sensitive minority position in the country when one of their writers exposes what we might call, the flaws of people within that.
Yeah.
Italians do not like all these novels and films depicting Italians as mafiosi,
Right.
because what it produces in the general public mind is the Italian as gangster.
Yeah.
But The Godfather is considered one of the greatest films, in American tradition. So it is this incredible mix of public sensitivity and private literary courage that makes literature so fascinating.
Yeah. I'm
It
Italian.
also says something about us as the audience,
Yes.
that we're wanting to read these things. I see now Philip Roth as a brilliant but very sick man. And I wouldn't have said the brilliant until I listened to you and saw the interview today. But I tried to read Letting Go back in the 60s. And so when Portnoy's complaint came out, I only read about it. I knew I couldn't read it because reading Letting Go, I felt this man needs therapy so badly and I'm working reading him.
But your comment is very, very interesting. You started off saying we want to read these journeys into forbidden territory. And
Yes.
the question is why? What is the reader's motivation for allowing the writer to lead him or her into these forbidden waters?
Yeah.
Freud would say because every single human being, by definition, struggles with the id. The id is that fount of inchoate but primitive and powerful drives that are so strong that we have to constrain them by the imposed force of our ego and superego. People think about sex all the time, but you can't manifest, you can't operate, you can't put into effect these powerful drives because they violate marital rules, they violate societal rules, but there they are. We have them. And they come out in dreams, they come out in fantasies, they come out in daydreams. We know that. And maybe that's what Roth is really talking about. And that's the therapeutic aim of his kind of literature. Yes.
Of course, Roth deals with serious issues. However, I am struck with what I've read of his by the humor. There's a quiet humor and affection for the characters that he writes about. And I think that's what saves his novels and probably his life from being totally grim. I was struck in the interview by the last questions that he was asked, and then what he said. The interviewer asked him, so what did you do for fun last year? And he says, I don't remember. And then she asks, and what are you going to do this year? And he says, I haven't decided yet. And I think that's very typical of Ross. He knows how to, how can I put it? Modify his tragedy with a sense of comedy. And I think to a degree, that's a characteristic of Jews, both in the entertainment world and also in writing.
Interesting.
Very good. Yeah. When I first read Portnoy's complaint, in all seriousness, I never laughed so hard in my life. I broke up into extravagant laughter. It was the funniest book I'd ever read in my life. Now, when the humor on the written page was transcribed onto the screen, what was hilarious on the written page becomes ludicrous, vulgar, and offensive on the screen. Why that transition proves so much a failure is a really interesting discussion unto itself. But Roth is superbly funny. I have a friend who met him through a mutual friend over a weekend, as a matter of fact. And he found Roth to be extremely dour and elusive and sort of removed. At other times, people say he was so hilarious. His mimicry was so on target, so brilliant. Now, you should also know, and I think this biography points out very clearly, even in his austere, normal, everyday way of life, he broke it up by going into New York City, mingling with his friends, going to the theater, going out to nice restaurants. And on his 80th birthday, there's another interview with Roth, which shows him on his 80th birthday being feted at a birthday party with hundreds of people from Newark celebrating his 80th birthday. And he was the center of this big crowd.
Yeah.
Now, 50 years ago, those very same people from Newark were horrified at, Goodbye Columbus. Or one other point before we leave. I've taught Goodbye Columbus quite a few times, particularly at Northeastern. And then I gave a presentation on Philip Roth at a synagogue, actually, in Wellesley. And I showed the clip from the film Goodbye Columbus, showing the Jewish wedding. I don't know how many of you remember this scene. And I was really curious. I asked the people how they reacted to that scene now, 2015, whenever I did this. And I wanted to see if there were major differences between the reaction now and the way people may have reacted in 1969. I'll tell you what amazed me. Many people still felt uncomfortable with that scene, even today.
Yeah.
If you haven't seen the movie in years or never saw it at all, rent it, go to Netflix and rent it. It's a very good film, well done. But the wedding scene is still in the minds of a number of people, particularly in our age category, it's still problematic. So, as the French say, the more things change, the more they remain the same.
Yeah.
Applicable to this issue of Philip Roth. Well, thank you so much. Again, it's such a pleasure being with you. Chris, thanks so much for arranging this. I look forward to seeing you again, and have a lovely, lovely weekend, all of you, okay?